The Adventures of Penelope the Purple Puppy. Story time for Ansley. Once upon a time, there was a purple puppy named Penelope. Purple is a very rare color for puppies, and she felt very special to have her long purple hair, 'cause huskies have long hair. She lived on a farm with the farmer and her mom and her dad and many animals. And most of the animals were her friends, and she loved to play with them. But one day, the farmer had a visitor. His nephew came over and brought his puppy. This puppy was a smaller puppy and was also very rarely colored. This puppy had zigzaggy straps of pink running all over it. And Penelope thought it was the prettiest color pink she had ever seen. She was very nervous. The only other puppies she had ever got to know were her mom and dad. So she was scared and nervous to meet the new puppy, so she hid behind her daddy. And her daddy said, "Now, Penelope, that is no way to make friends. Go say hello. I've got to go to work and shepherd the sheep and keep them out of trouble. You know how much trouble the sheep get into. I've got to go make sure they stay out of the garden." So Penelope's dad trotted off towards the herd of sheep that were quickly becoming not a herd, and began barking and yipping and rounding them up. And Penelope watched the other puppy for a little while, and it hid behind the nephew of the farmer. It hid behind his big galoshes and would peep out sometimes to stare at Penelope. And Penelope slowly made her way over, sniffing the air. And Penelope could smell the farmer. It was a very familiar and comfortable smell. And she could smell the nephew, who smelled kind of like the farmer, but different. He had different animals on his farm, and Penelope could smell every one of them. And it smelled like he also had a pet ferret, which Penelope had smelled before, but never had a chance to meet. But she hoped to one day, because they smelled very interesting. And she smelled the puppy. And this puppy smelled very much like a regular puppy. And so she crept over, and the puppy would sniff at her. And they sniffed back and forth for a long while before they finally got close enough. And the pink-strapped puppy would slowly walk out from behind the nephew farmer and slowly got closer to Penelope as she got closer, until finally they were nose to nose, sniffing, trying to sniff each other out and see if they could be friends. And they started circling each other, sniffing and walking in circles and wagging their tails. And they thought, maybe we can be friends. And Penelope said, "Hello, my name is Penelope. Welcome to my farm." And the pink-strapped puppy said, "I'm glad to be here. It's a very interesting farm. My name is Susy." So Susy, the pink-striped puppy, and Penelope, the purple puppy, decided to go for a walk around the farm. Penelope was very excited to show off the farm. She had never got to give a tour before, so she strutted around with Susy following close behind, both of their tails waggling. So first, Penelope showed Susy the pig pit. And it was full of mud this time of day, so the pigs could waller around in it and get cooled off in the mud. And Tobias the pig was the farmer's prized pig. He had just won a ribbon at the state fair, thanks to a nice pep talk from Penelope. And Tobias said, "Hello," as they walked by, and he flopped into the mud, almost splattering Susy with mud. And Susy giggled and jumped back. And Penelope said, "Be careful, he does that." And next they wandered over to the cows who were grazing in the field. And Penelope said that the cows didn't talk much, but when they did, it was always some kind of wisdom, and very useful wisdom. And so Penelope wandered over to the pond where the cows would occasionally get a drink, and where the ducks and geese lived. And the ducks and geese quacked and hissed and made geese noises to say hello. Susy nodded politely as they walked by. And the geese and ducks waddled off into the lake with their various noises and flappings of their wings. And next Penelope came into the barn, where the horses were. They were currently in the barn getting out of the sun for a little while. And Penelope had a little bed in the corner of the barn. And this is where Penelope's mom and dad stayed, was in the barn. And the barn smelled like hay and horses. Susy came up to one of the horses and said, "Hello, I've never seen a horse before. The farmer on my farm always talks about getting horses, but never has, and I've always thought they were quite fascinating." And an old horse nodded regally and bowed a bit to Susy and said, "Well, it's nice to meet you, young lady. And quite a flattering tone you have when regarding a horse. My name's old Bob, and I used to be a racing horse, but I've come to this farm to retire after all of my winning." And Penelope giggled and said that old Bob had the best stories about when he used to race the other horses and how he would win. And Susy and Penelope thanked Bob for his time and went off further into the farm. Towards the edge of the clearing, there was a forest. Penelope told Susy she'd been in the forest a few times, but sometimes it's a little scary, and she doesn't like to go alone. And Susy said that there was a forest near her house, and she plays in it all the time with her brother. They like to run and play tag. And Penelope said she had never played tag before. "How do you play?" And Susy jumped and nipped her right on the ribs and jumped back. And Penelope said, "Hey, what was that for?" And Susy said, "Now you have to chase me, 'cause you're it. And you gotta tag me now." So Penelope took off running, her ears flattened back, and her hair sleek in the wind. She dipped her head for extra speed as she ran through the tall grass towards Susy, who was headed towards the forest. Susy made it into the forest, and Penelope chased quickly after her. Susy started weaving and dodging between the trees, and Penelope weaved and dodged right behind her, almost catching up before Susy would pull ahead again. Susy was very fast. Penelope had a hard time keeping up. Eventually, Penelope was able to catch up to Susy and nipped her on the tail. And Susy tripped and stumbled and rolled with a giggle and jumped up. And Penelope turned quick around a tree and took off in the other direction. And Susy chased after her. And they played and played for what seemed like forever, back and forth in the forest, running and chasing over the squishy moss and over the crunchy leaves, stirring up all kinds of forest smells. Earthy, rooty, tree-y. One time, Susy trampled over a bunch of blue flowers that were growing in a sunspot that was shining down through the canopy, and it filled the area full of a perfume flower smell. And they ran around and played in the smell and giggled at each other and then rolled around on the flowers because it smelled so good, and their feet sticking and waggling up in the air as they rolled in the flowers so they could smell good too. And Penelope and Susy decided it was time to head back. They were tired after all their running. So they walked back slowly to the farm and talked and laughed and talked about all the funny things that happened while they were playing, like the look on the owl's face that kept getting woke up so they were giggling and running and yipping. And the grumpy old owl screeched at him and flew away and nearly scared them right out of their fur. And they couldn't help but laugh, even though at the time it was very scary. So they walked back and stopped at the pond to get a long drink of cool water. And now all the cows and horses were out because it was starting to get dark and cooling off. And they also were round the lake getting water, laying and enjoying the last few rays of sun before it went down. Penelope and Susy sat and stared up at the sky, watching the sunset, and it was very pretty. It was gorgeous colors. It was all the colors the dog could see, in every shade of gray, and it was one of the most beautiful sunsets that the dogs had ever seen. The wind and breeze blowing in had all kinds of different smells of people cooking dinner and taking out garbage. And it had smells of things in the forest that were rustling around, and the trees, the lingering smells that they had stirred up with all their running through the forest. And it was a very relaxing sunset after a long day of playing. And after a while of watching the sunset, they heard the nephew start yelling for Susy and whistling and calling her, "Here, Susy. Come here, Susy." And Susy jumped up with her tail wagging and told Penelope it was time for her to go, but she had such a fun time playing, and she hopes she gets to come back and see her again. Maybe next time they could go to Susy's farm. And so Penelope and Susy touched noses, as good friends do. And then Susy went off and jumped into the nephew farmer's truck, and they drove off. Penelope walked up and rubbed her head against her farmer's leg. He reached down and patted her across the ribs and scratched the top of her head and told her she was a good dog and asked her if she had fun showing Susy around the farm and playing. And Penelope just wagged her tail and stuck out her tongue. And the farmer went inside and got a scoop of food for Penelope and put it in her bowl that was next to her doghouse, that was next to the farmer's house. And Penelope ate and thought about the day and thought about the future where she might get to go play again, and thought this was one of the best days that Penelope had ever had, especially because she got to make a new friend. And Penelope curled up in her doghouse on her favorite old cushion, and with a huff and heavy eyelids closing, her ears slowly drooped down across her head, and Penelope was fast asleep, off to dream of new adventures. The end.